maybe a month ago. So it's good that Raj is in the sociology department, and maybe David Otter should also get a courtesy appointment. The paper concludes the findings, quote, support Wilson's observation that manufacturing contractions shrink the pool of economically secure young adult men and erode traditional household arrangements. Our analysis indicates that Wilson's conclusions apply to a far broader group of adults than the urban poor African Americans on whom he focused, and the magnitude of these effects is sizable. Finally, let me end in Work Disappears. Bill presented his broader vision for social policy reform, which included a call for many policy reforms, including the establishment of a program that would provide public jobs of last resort to anyone who wants a job. Jason mentioned America Unequal, which Peter Gottschalk and I wrote shortly before that. Bill wrote, quote, the labor-intensive public service jobs program advanced by Danziger and Gottschalk is designed to generate employment opportunities for workers with low skills and little or no work experience. However, since it is explicitly aimed at poor workers, it runs the risk of carrying a stigma. He then proposed a much broader program, the creation of WPA-style jobs aimed at broad segments of the population. I don't have time to argue with Bill today about jobs of last resort. I think I still favor a smaller program than he does. But I want to conclude with one more indication of Bill's lasting legacy. The Russell Sage Foundation has just announced a new program with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is designed to fund small grants for underrepresented scholars in the social sciences. And an RFP has been drafted. It will be released by the end of the month. So you should, if you have students and former students. Let me just read you the titles of the sections. And it's not a coincidence, but it happens to be something that's just been developed. Gentrification, segregation, and housing choice. Young adults of color, criminal justice and the legal system, neighborhood characteristics and place-based interventions, education and affirmative action, and then, of course, the usual suspects of poverty and inequality. As I thought about the panel today, I thought, gee, this RFP was put together by an expert panel, and they didn't know, they should attune. To me, it was like, oh, wait a minute, I've got this thing on my desk, and it's all about Bill Wilson.
So does anyone know where this is? Yes, Lindsay knows. Celeste knows. This is the Rebecca Crown Center at Northwestern University. It was during my first year of graduate school, and if memory serves, Sandy Jenks isn't here, so he can't tell me I'm lying. It was at my very first academic symposium in the basement of this building that Bill Wilson spoke, outlining the thesis of the truly disadvantaged. Now, I can't say that the fire alarm went off, but for me, it was a truly electric moment. And of course, as luck would have it, even though I was a student at Northwestern, Bill had soon heard all about the fact that I was interviewing low-income single mothers, welfare mothers, about how they made ends meet. And I was commanded to come to the University of Chicago. Probably not commanded, but summoned to the University of Chicago, and I was taken down into the bowels of the Nork building where Jolene Kirshenman guarded the addresses of people in the urban poverty and family life study, UPFLS. And so 10 of the people in Making Ends Meet were actually from that survey, because Bill wanted to see if my snowball sampling conclusions would be challenged by something more representative and random. And in fact, if you read his work, the words representative come through again and again. The story I'm going to tell today is really a methodological story. I think Bill is one of the most, maybe even the most creative methodologist of all time, and I've always been fascinated by and sought to emulate that style. Hopefully, I haven't done it in an embarrassing way. I guess we'll see. But I'm going to show you a slightly different image, if I can get this to work. This isn't the unemployment rates. This is from the truly disadvantaged. This is the concentration of poverty. So the concentration effects map comparing 1970 to 1980 in Chicago. And this image, which he showed that night at the Rebecca Crown Center, was like seared in my brain as a young scholar. Using these maps, right, he argued that something had changed at the bottom for people who are on the economic margins of society. Something fundamental. And that these changes had consequences for life chances, particularly for the African American poor. But if you know anything about Bill's trajectory since then, and I got to watch this at close range because I became then part of the training program that Bill and Sandy Jenks set up on the urban underclass between Northwestern and the University of Chicago. Subsequent books would show the groundbreaking research presented in The Truly Disadvantaged was just the beginning. So this book drew from the census. But soon, in fact, he described this that night at the Rebecca Crown Center. He was launching the Urban Poverty and Family Life Study. Little known fact, there are, I believe, 178 unstructured, in-depth interviews as a part of that study. Soon, he realized that there were two subpopulations in Chicago that deserve special attention, so he launched two studies of those populations. Those included both surveys and focus groups. And I can't believe this hasn't come up yet. He selected 10 representative neighborhoods in Chicago and sent ethnographers out, including several people in this room, to investigate life in a fine, granular way in those neighborhoods. So you see this movement between census and survey and focus group and in-depth interview and ethnographic data in this iterative way of answering a question. And to me, that was what was most amazing about what I was observing as a young graduate student and assistant professor. Now, I am not Bill Wilson, but I am going to humbly offer an image. Now, I think this image qualifies as provocative. I'm pretty sure that my good friend Bruce Meyer has not slept well since I produced with Luke Schaefer this graph. That's kind of an inside joke, but he is my friend. So what this graph shows is the first hint of a follow-up on an insight I had while doing in-depth interviews, fieldwork in Baltimore. And in that fieldwork around 2010, I was meeting more and more families who were living virtually cashless lives. They may have had a housing subsidy, they may have had food stamps, but they had no cash from welfare, they had no cash from work, nothing from SSI, nothing from unemployment insurance. And so this basically charts the rise in the number of households with children living virtually cashless lives since around the time of welfare reform. So again, this was prima facie evidence that some set of conditions have changed for those on the economic margins of society. And that might be a fundamental change. And my hypothesis, working from these interviews in Baltimore, is that in the aftermath of welfare reform, more and more poor families with children were living virtually cashless lives for significant spells of time. Now, that last tag is really important because we don't have a binary here, right? Well, like we had when we talked about the underclass debate, the non-working poor, the poor that were isolated from the world of work, because the most typical event prior to the start of a spell of virtually cashless living is the loss of a job. So these are people hanging on to the ragged edge of a spiraling labor market that is literally dissolving in their grasp. And my hunch was that these changes might be consequential. So just a little pushback to Tom, my old neighbor from Philadelphia. In some ways, the somewhat disadvantaged and the truly disadvantaged are now the same people at different points in time. So, as a disciple of Bill Wilson, I couldn't stop here. I had to go further, and I said to myself, if this is a trend, we should be able to see it in all kinds of data. And so I think Luke and I have explored every single data source available to us on a nationally representative level. This is the CPS and the American Community Survey. If you plot these against the estimates we made from the Survey of Income and Program Participation, which is what I showed you first, they're very nearly identical. But surveys have lots of liabilities. It turns out people forget to tell survey researchers that they receive public benefits. So we next went to administrative data. These are administrative data from the SNAP program, the food stamp program, and this is the number of poor families with children who report zero income at the time of application or reapplication. It's really hard to claim zero income. You have to provide all kinds of documentations that you really are zero income. And so this is astonishing. The little blue diamonds are our original estimates from the Survey of Income and Program Participation. And you can see that if anything, at the end of the period, we've probably underestimated the trend because so many more households with children are living outside of traditional family living units and in fact are homeless. So in good William Julius Wilson fashion, we had to go further. If this was indeed something that was real, we should be able to go to 4 places where we didn't live, spend a couple of months, find families in this condition, and follow them over months and years. And of course, we did, and that is the subject of the book, $2 a Day. From that work, we developed a 3-legged stool of hypotheses about what was causing the rise in the number of households with children living virtually cashless lives for considerable spells of time. First is the veritable death of welfare. Second, as I mentioned, is the increasingly perilous nature of work. And third is the affordable housing crisis. So we needed to go back to the numbers to see what we saw in terms of evidence. Here is a map illustrating the veritable death of welfare. What you can see here is that only 4 states have any meaningful welfare system left: Vermont, New York, Minnesota, and California. You'll see that the South, the Deep South, and the Mountain States have virtually no welfare programs left. You may wonder whether this matters. Well, I'm going to give you just a little bit of, again, prima facie evidence. This is a map of the number of children in America living in households with no cash. And you can see a remarkable correspondence. So this is one way of looking at the affordable housing crisis. This is the number of homeless students as reported by their schools. Again, you may say, is this caused by welfare reform? We used state-by-year fixed effects to answer this question because it turns out welfare is being reformed every year. Fewer and fewer people are on the rolls. And what we found was astonishing. For every 100 fewer TANF cases within a state, over the course of a year, we see 14 more homeless students. That's 14 more homeless students. Now, our ethnography also gave us clues about how people were surviving and the costs of those survival strategies. Private charity and plasma donations were almost ubiquitous in our samples. So again, we go back to the numbers. Here's what's happening to our nation's food pantries. This is my favorite plasma clinic in Cleveland, Ohio. There's a little bar there called the Stagger Inn. I used to park in front of that bar and just watch people get off the bus. There's a bus stop right here. 30 or 40 people going right to CSL Plasma. A film crew I advised was filming the plasma clinic in the middle of a snowstorm a couple of winters ago, and one woman was standing in line barefoot. This is what has happened to plasma plasma collections over the time since welfare reform. We geocoded every single plasma clinic in the United States. And the single biggest predictor of where a plasma clinic will be located is not the poverty rate in the tract, but the rate of deep poverty. So, is living without cash in America really so bad? Aren't the American poor rich by global standards? I spent a lot of time over the last few years in the Bloomberg School of Public Health at JHU, Johns Hopkins, partly motivated by the insights of MTO, which showed that disadvantage was often first evidenced by health. So consider these facts. For disadvantaged segments of American society, our peers are not Sweden or France or even the UK. But for the critical outcomes of life expectancy and low birth weight, we are peers with Lebanon, Mongolia, Tonga, and Grenada. I like to end by quoting my colleague Luke. This quote, I think, speaks to debates that are going on right now in Washington about whether poverty exists and how we should measure it. He writes, "We live in an America where the poor sell their blood plasma just to scrape by, fueling a multi-billion-dollar industry, where infant mortality among the vulnerable ranks with much poorer nations, and where life expectancy is well below much poorer countries and falling. We can argue about the causes and the consequences of poverty and what to do about it. But can anyone really argue that we've solved it?" Thank you.
Well, I guess I could be following Cornel West, but that was certainly very depressing. That said, this has been an extraordinary day, really quite amazing. And indeed, I am not prone to being frightened of appearing, but today comes very close. Indeed, I'm very much reminded, this will echo some, that this may be the most extraordinary collection of talent and human knowledge that's probably been ever collected for an event at Harvard University, I'd say, with the possible exception of when Bill Wilson speaks alone. This is, of course, echoing John F. Kennedy, Bill, like for many of us, really changed my life. And in a funny sort of way, look, I'm an economist, at least I used to be one. And economists, as has been mentioned, we believe in individuals and we believe in structural things. It's called the market. But beyond that, that's pretty much what's interesting. And this guy, Wilson, pretty early on in my career, he comes up and he's got this story about race and class and work and family and neighborhood and concentrated poverty and, criminal justice, even social and economic policy. Now, look, we have 6 panels here. We have whole courses at Harvard, years of things for just that topic. Bill not only talks about each of them, he talks about how they all fit into each other and how one explains the next in a way that's a narrative that any ordinary politician can understand. And that was just like, holy mackerel. And that is actually genius. It's that notion that all of these pieces fit together. Yes, well, that's what we do. We're academics. We complexify. But he didn't complexify, he simplified, he helped us understand. And again, to turn out to be right to boot is really quite unbelievable. And I would just like to simply emphasize there was one other thing here. It took unbelievable courage. People talked about how he took some abuse and so forth. Pat Moynihan's name was evoked recently in one of the earlier sessions. In, I think, 1983, Pat Moynihan came to the Kennedy School to speak on some unrelated topic. And I had a beard much bigger and darker than now, and so forth. And I came up to him, just a young assistant professor, and I said, Senator Moynihan, I'm David Elwood. That Moynihan report you wrote was actually quite insightful and had some really interesting elements to it. And he looked at me, and he looked away, and he looked at me, and through his teeth, he said, "It took me 10 years to get over that report," and walked away. He thought it was a trap. And yet, 3 years later, Bill comes out with the Julius advantage and the remarkable Wilson and Neckerman paper and so forth, and he then gave the Godkin lectures on family and so forth. He was back. But it was enormously courageous to do those kinds of things. And again, that was something for us all to see. Now, I want to focus on work, because that's, after all, the title of this session, but also I wanted to do something which is to talk about policy. We've been blissfully quiet about policy almost throughout this. I mean, Raj did something a little bit there, but I mean, just to kind of update slightly the wonderful narrative about how Bill came last night. He became the Malcolm Weiner Professor of Social Policy. Just so, I don't know how that happened. Yeah, I do actually. But so he came here because we think about answers as well as analyses of whatever. And so I'd like to focus a little bit on work and on to at least begin thinking about answers. And given we're focusing on work, to me, I would just talk about, the book When Work Disappears really captures a huge part. That whole narrative that he tells, to me, a lot of it in terms of what's changing is work changing, and then tracing through the consequences that has for people, for families, for communities, and so forth. He was prescient, and he actually mentions this in the book and so on, that this wasn't just affecting African-American families or whatever, it was starting to affect the whole community. And since then, we think the middle class has just kind of gotten wiped out. Technology is changing everything. Technology was only a blip on the horizon back in '86. I mean, we didn't even have email. We literally didn't. It's absolutely true. And that was, and I think, to quote a different one of Raj Chetty's facts, if you look now at what happens to, if you think about mobility as kind of how do you do relative to your parents, a little bit what was here, and you ask yourself, if you were born in the 1940s, late 1940s, what were the odds that you did better than your parents? You had more income than your parents. And his story, as most of you have seen, back then it was 90%. Now it's 50%. You got to ask, what are the odds that you do no better than if half the people do worse than their parents did? And by the way, if you look just at men, it would be 40%. Now that one fact, in so many ways, just as Bill used it to explain a lot of changes, to me that tells us as much as we need to know about why people are so angry, why we're partisan. There's somebody has to be wrong. Somebody's to blame. I don't know whether it's business or I don't know whether it's government, but it certainly is something to be angry about. And thank goodness for drugs. And to me, that was Bill. That's Bill's theory, and he called it When Work Disappears. But you know what? Actually, our unemployment rate is super low right now. I mean, it's about as good as it gets. Kathy Newman made this point. And there's a whole industry of people saying, I wish Bill had renamed his book something slightly to be about what it was really about, not what he's. And if I had to enter that, I would say When Good Work Disappears. And of course, that really is what the book's about. And I think fundamentally here, the issue is I don't think there's ever going to be a shortage of jobs. I think there's a shortage of good jobs. And what does that mean and where does that take us? That's the policy question that I think we have to wrestle with. Now, the typical answer for this, particularly from economists like me, is it's education. Okay, education, we need to educate people for the jobs of the 21st century, the world jobs, and so forth. And goodness knows I'm in favor of that. I think it's absolutely central, and of course, that's what we try and do. But I was recently part of a group that a number of folks here were a part of. We did site visits all around the country, and we actually talked with lots of people that are low-wage workers. And the striking thing is, they're doing things that are unbelievably important. I am a grandparent twice over right now. Best thing in the world. I recommend it. Skip the children. Just go right. And I am not ready for a robot to take care of my children, and then someone has to take care of them because, my daughters are working. I am not ready for, for my mother, sadly, is got dementia. Again, I'm not ready for a cute little robot dog to make her feel great. And in job after job after job, the things that must be done are not going to be done by technology. And in fact, they're really important jobs, except they're bad jobs. We have made them somehow bad jobs. And what is so striking when you go out and talk to people, low-income people doing all kinds of work of various sorts, is they're also invisible. This is also something in Bill, but it was come up a little bit. People of color especially are very visible when we talk about violence, when we talk about criminal justice, when we talk about family decay, when we talk about all kinds of things. But when we talk about them working, we don't want them to be seen. We don't even notice they exist. They clean our rooms, they do all kinds of unbelievably important jobs, and they don't exist to us. They are them. They are the working poor. They're not struggling people like us. And by the way, it's getting worse, and Larry and others, David Otter and so on, increasingly, you can't work your way from the mailroom to the CEO's office if you ever could, because the mailroom is handled by somebody else, and oh, by the way, there isn't a mailroom. But other than that, and so really the question for me, in many ways, is this. How do we turn those so-called bad jobs into the good jobs that they really are? We really do need those jobs, and we really have to find a way to do that. Now, some of that to me is the kind of work that a group like this has to do, because some of it is about making work pay. So earning income tax credit, many of you know I'm a big fan. And that's a way to make work pay better. Maybe the higher minimum wage is a way. You can do things about pay. But is pay all of it? It's certainly important. It's certainly unbelievably important. But isn't it also about having a sense of a future, a sense of control over your destiny? You talk to care workers and they'll say, I work for this person for 5 years and, or for 3 weeks or whatever. They've got me on full time. Friday, they mentioned that they were going away for 3 weeks. I'm not going to come back for 3 weeks. I have no way to survive for 3 weeks without. And on the other hand, if I work for a firm, okay, you get the story. So it's something more than this. It's something about pay. It's something about benefits. It's something about portability. That's kind of economist kind of things. But it's also something about having a job ladder, going someplace. It's about being recognized for good work. One aside, just it's on my mind. As part of these things going on all around the country, I heard something that most of you will know, but as an economist, white guy, I probably clueless. They said, and you talk to people who are waiters, wait staff, whatever. They say the best tippers are low-income families. And, my wife and I always had this little argument. She'd always give the biggest tip to the worst service because no one else gave them tips. Okay, listen, you are a liberal. But you know what? She was right and I was wrong. Because what happens with low-income families, they say, oh my gosh, did you see that woman? She got the order all confused, everything's mixed up and so forth. She is dragging. She must have 2 kids at home. This is her 3rd job. She's barely holding it together. She needs it more than me. And again, that's because invisibility, this isn't just about economics. This is about thinking about how do we create a future. And let me end with one mild anecdote, which is not perfect, but is an interesting example of turning bad jobs into good jobs. U.S. military, some, 15, 20 years ago, discovered they had a problem. When people would come back from deployments, 9 months later, there would be a baby boom. No one could figure out why this was, how that happened, but they did a study, and they decided that people did not want to go back to deployment, be in harm's way, whatever, if their families were not in good shape, and it turned out military childcare was limited and bad, and people weren't paid very well and so forth. So it was a disaster. In fact, there was a big Inspector General's report and so forth, back when we took Inspector Generals seriously. So they decided they had to fix that. And so they decided they were going to be the gold standard. And they decided we're going to have good places. We're going to have a good leader. We're going to have people. We're going to have to train our child care workers to deal with the unique problems facing children whose parents are away for extended periods, some of them are in harm's way and so forth. And by the way, to retain those people and make it all work, we've got to raise wages by 30%. Now guess what? That was a four-way win. That was good to the military, they wouldn't have done it. That was good for the parents, because of course their children were better cared for. That was good for the kids, because they were in a much better situation. And it was good for the workers. Now, I believe the market for low-wage workers is just broken. I think we just, I think Catherine Newman talks about how Kathy Eden, talks about how, you don't show up for a job for 4 or 5 days, low-wage job, you're gone no matter what. You could have been working hard for 5 years, but your brother-in-law borrowed the truck, didn't happen to mention that he used up all the gas, and that's that. You can't get to work for 3 or 4 days because you can't pay for the tow, you can't pay for anything. That's a great worker. The system knows it. Does anyone call Walmart and say, gee, is so-and-so a really good worker? What happened with him? Never happens. There's no information in that market in a time when we're in the information age. It's a market failure, and that's what we economists should be working on too. So with that, I want to stop, but also to say thank you, Bill. Thank you for making work fundamental. Thank you for helping us understand, as economists at least, how much more important it is than simply a wage. And I only have one request. Retire every 5 years. We can have the best conference in the last 5 years each time.
So I'm delighted to be here, the last speaker in a long day, but an incredibly illuminating one. So I will try to be reasonably brief. I mainly want to talk about Bill's amazing prescient insights about labor markets, building on some of the stuff David said, and continuing influence on labor market research and policy. But I also want to have a couple of anecdotes on the work on neighborhoods, and particularly how Bill's authority and insights were incredibly instrumental in launching the largest scale true experiment for testing neighborhood effects, which was moving to opportunity, something I've been working on for 27 years now, where in designing this, which is a randomized control trial with 10,000 families from public housing projects in Baltimore, Boston, Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago, much of the motivation was the truly disadvantaged, in particular, Bill's hypothesis of concentrated poverty and the sort of really differential effects of being in neighborhoods with above a 40% poverty rate. Somewhat arbitrary line, but Bill's authority meant we actually could design an experiment where the eligibility criteria was living in a census tract with over a 40% poverty rate in a public housing project or a project-based development. The only reason it ever ended up having enough statistical power to learn about the impacts of neighborhoods was the incredible contrast we had between the starting neighborhoods and where we were able to move them with incredible help of the strength of these families and of counselors and mobility to low poverty under 10% areas. But it was Bill's authority that was the driving force for setting up that way. And it was also Bill's influence that led us to engage the economists who would naturally just go out and look at the treatment effects and show you a bunch of numbers, to engage people like Kathy Eden, Stephanie DeLuca, and others in trying to really talk with the families and understand their motivations for moving and what it was like in the new neighborhoods, and to look at a broader range of outcomes than just employment and earnings, to focus on the health effects. It turns out for the adults, neighborhoods, as Raj said, there isn't that much connection between what's going on in your neighborhood employment and your own employment, but there's tremendous impact of that on health and well-being, which people like Kathy and Bill pointed us out to study. So much of the big data work that Raj is doing was clearly generated by the insights from the deeper understanding that Bill led us to have of neighborhoods. And I think there's a similar story in thinking about labor markets. As David pointed out, we shouldn't just think about non-employment, which is very important when work disappears. It's the combination of not being employed at all and not having a reasonable job. So this looks at men. You could do similar things for women. You could look at black men. But the striking thing, think about the early 70s and the changes that Bill was talking about, is only about 6% of men 25 to 54 weren't working at a point of time in 1973, and only about 9% had what we call below a poverty wage, below $12 an hour in today's dollars. That is a tremendous trend of both of these. Today about 12% of men, and if we looked at black men or men who are less educated, much higher, folks don't work at all. But there's a huge increase in the share who don't earn above $12 an hour, so that at the peak of the Great Recession, over a third of all men in the US economy were either not working at all or earning less than $12 an hour. And even today, in the tightest labor market we've seen, that's a number like 30% versus 10 to 15% it was in the early 70s, despite the fact that productivity has grown, sort of 90% in that period. So the growing inequality and the changes in access to good jobs have been a tremendously important factor behind the social distress we see. And just to reiterate, part of that, as Bill focused on, clearly are fundamental structural changes in the economy, changes in technology that have changed the type of work that's available, globalization, other things. But a lot of it also, and this is going to be important, is tied up with the neighborhood environments and social networks and job networks people have. If you actually, with the big data we have now available, micro data on every worker and every firm in the US economy, longitudinally, you can decompose the change in inequality since 1980 into what we call person effects. That is the persistent thing, whatever job you go into that the same person brings, that you might think of education, skills, or other things, and whether you get into a good job that pays someone like you a premium. And in 1980 and in the 1970s, there were a lot of people from not such advantaged elite backgrounds who, even without college degrees, who worked in high-wage jobs. And the correlation between what we call your person effect and your firm effect, it was positive, but it was pretty low. Today, it's extremely positive. So the same segregation that you've seen, neighborhood segregation of income of where people are living, is showing up in the labor market, so that if you decompose the growth of inequality, 60% of it's the standard stuff, person stuff, growing gaps in skills, the college wage premium. But 40%, which is massive, is increased sorting and segregation of who works with which firms. So the notion that you can be a janitor or cafeteria worker and get a job at General Motors or at Goldman Sachs and earn a pretty good wage and have good benefits, high union wage, that is really what has disappeared, so that, there's a fissuring of employment where even though you may be working in the same physical location, you're no longer employed by the high wage employer. And so as David said, trying to understand that process and how to upgrade jobs as well as skills is going to be very important in understanding the labor market trends. And so I want to just make 3 points about bills, from the truly disadvantaged and when work disappears, that have really changed the way we think about labor markets. So I'll tell you a story of economists and Bill were noticing a lot of similar things in the mid-1980s about pockets of declining employment in the US and Europe. There was tremendous increase in persistent non-employment and unemployment. And economists had a number of models that were very individualistic or sometimes institutional to tell you why this should persist and why we should worry about these demands. One of them, Larry Summers and Olivier Blanchard, had a model of unions. Interesting, probably hasn't stood the test of time very well, arguing that if you have a negative shock and some people lose job, the union's going to become more vigilant because it'll lose its low-wage workers and it'll push for higher wages in the future, and you'll see persistent non-employment because wages are so high. That clearly doesn't seem to be what's happened with this growth of low-wage jobs. There were then a lot of economists in Europe arguing for things closer to Bill, that you sort of lose your skills when you become employed, but they're very, very individualistic. The longer you're unemployed, the less employable you are to employers, and that's why when you get a negative shock, it's really sort of hard to recover. When I was reading The Truly Disadvantaged, 80s, what struck me was that he had a hypothesis that seemed much more plausible for the persistence, joblessness, that combined, you lose a job, there's a demand, particularly in high-wage jobs, you become unemployed, but operated through the social structure rather than through just things in the labor market and just what you were doing individually. That when there becomes a community, has a rise in joblessness, you lose the sort of connections to employment networks to the better jobs, you end up with the types of social problems we've seen in sort of these neighborhoods, and so the next generation does not have the connections to employment. It changes the attitudes of employers in the way Bill described then and when work disappears, so that even if you do get the skills, they don't take you seriously if you're from a minority group or from certain neighborhoods, or you're assumed to have a drug problem. And so it's a much richer model of what's actually gone on. And it suggests that, a couple things include in terms of policy where we now have evidence, which is you need to run a really tight labor market persistently, or employers aren't going to take a chance with people who don't have the sort of connections. So that's a necessary condition, but it may not be sufficient. Even in a really tight labor market, maybe, as David Elwood said, they'll pick the robot rather than the worker. Trust them, or Sheldon. You also need a way to rebuild those connections, even if you have a good education, if no one's going to believe or give you a shot. And so what we've been testing recently, and I would say and Bill has been incredibly influential. He was served on the board of MDRC for many years and was one of the innovators. He actually got me connected to working on sectoral employment training programs through public-private ventures programs of this about a decade ago. There are a number of standard things that Bill pushed, expanding the earned income tax credit for groups that are left behind, particularly single men and single women who don't have dependent children, where we've been running tests with MDRC and show you can clearly improve people's take-home income, reduce extreme poverty through such policies. There are a lot of community colleges that have been taking seriously the building of connections, but I want to focus briefly on 2 types of programs that look incredibly good relative to when I served in the Labor Department in the Clinton administration and we reviewed training programs. What we found, and what traditional training programs did, is they focused on the skills training or getting you quickly with a temporary help firm into a job, is you could speed up people get into a job, but not really change their trajectory. So if I look 1 year out, I'll improve their earnings because they're unemployed a little shorter. But if I look 5 years out, I don't see much of anything because basically I'm not breaking the cycle of the type of job they can get into. What you need to really get here is something that replaces what was lost in the network with the huge decline of high-wage employment of members of your community in the 70s and the 80s, which is there's a little bit of, it's not for everyone, there's a little bit of screening in the same way someone referring you to a job would do. They wouldn't refer anyone. They wouldn't continue with their employer. There's a bit of basically life skills sort of training, soft skills to get you in. You need to actually have the skills, so there's occupational training, ideally for things that there's a demand for now, but have a process of growth. But then there's personal connections that a nonprofit, and we're talking about organizations in Boston, the Jewish Vocational Services, in New York, Père Scholas, which is a nonprofit, here in Boston, Year Up. And what we found remarkably from these sorts of policies versus the traditional training programs is we now have 9 randomized control trials. And in 8 of the 9 and 7 of 8 different programs, what we're finding is this model is not just getting you a little bit of an increase, but putting you on a completely different trajectory. So this was the first sectoral employment study. It's raising earnings by about 20–25%, getting people into higher wage jobs. The mechanism is getting you into occupations which have much higher average wages and starting you and getting you on a trajectory. And even 9 years out in Project Quest in San Antonio, what we're seeing is taking people who would be earning $28,000, making it $35,000, but of those who are really going through the program, 30–50% wage increases and breaking it. So what I want to conclude is while we've seen, there are a lot of discouraging trends, atomistic policies, things like the earned income tax credit, vouchers for housing can help. But both what we've seen in the housing market and the work we're doing in creating moves to opportunity with Raj and in the labor market is these social networks and connections, aren't things. A landlord doesn't take you seriously even if you have a voucher without a bit of an intervention and the same thing with an employer is we need to combine the sort of knowledge that Bill has brought of the community and the social connections with good economic policies if we're going to have lasting impacts.
We now have all of 6 minutes for questions and discussion. So what I would like to do is invite a set of questions, and then panelists can take those. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Daniel. I'm a former student of Professor Wilson's from a few years ago. I now work in New York, working with the city and the Department of Education. And I'm curious, as we heard in the past couple of panels, the impact of neighborhoods on children in particular. And I'm wondering, in terms of these social networks and institutions and neighborhoods, is there evidence of the impact of strengthening networks and institutions on children through things like schools, community organizations, after-school programs, other things that work with children? Or is that mechanism more through networks for the parents that then pass on that beneficial exposure to their children? I'm not sure if anyone's doing research on that, but very curious because it's very applicable to our work. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. Let's take turns, bounce back and forth.
I just wanted to say, and the last speaker spoke on it, as far as community colleges are concerned, and there's a push for like free community colleges, would you discourage a person who doesn't have the ability to get into an Ivy school from studying sociology or Afro-American courses because because they might not be able to write a book or whatever? Would you tell them to study more STEM courses?
Thank you.
Because of the practicality?
This is a question for Kathy. Kathy, as you know, we're huge fans of the $2 a day work, probably the biggest promoters of your book in Washington. Two of your graphs, one on the increase in people below $2 a day, the other the increase on people on food stamps with no cash income, meaning basically no cash welfare and no wage income, which is cash. Those graphs, if I remember, one went through 2011 and one went through 2013. Unemployment rates were high then, now 3.7%. So I'm really interested, are you guys going to update the data through 2018? I think David's right that a lot of these new jobs aren't good jobs. They do give you some cash income and qualify you for the EITC and child tax credit if you have kids. My guess would be that both of those graphs would show some downward trend as the unemployment rate goes down, but still be well above where they were before repeal of the 96 welfare law. But that's a hunch. It would be really important to see those data, so I'm hoping there's research to develop them.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for a great panel. My question is for Lawrence Katz and David Elwood. It's about employment. I was fully convinced by the argument that the jobs need to be upgraded, but I had a question regarding the kind of also shifts in power and political mobilization that is needed for that, especially since when we discuss kind of practical solutions that sound great, they actually still built from the individual level, and they don't take into account that there are some jobs that are still at the bottom, right? Like if you're a janitor and that remain at the bottom, and that those might still deserve living wages. And I come from a country where one of the economic common senses in France is that labor protections have been an impediment to employment, and there's this trade-off between good jobs and any jobs, and we are supposed to have a dual job market in which protections for some come at the disadvantage of the durably unemployed, with the result that policies are now frittering away labor protections. And I think in part this is due to a lack of power distribution that would allow other kind of solutions to be considered, and a change in kind of the way in which we think about this supposed trade-off. So thank you for any thoughts.
Thank you. One last question.
And bonjour. So I flew from France to honor the fact that Bill has really changed the way I view the world. So thank you very much. I was in Bill's last class last year. And in my last paper, maybe, I wrote that help is not on the way. After such a grim, set of facts being exposed, you will get my point. But I work as a practitioner with associations, international organizations, and municipalities in France, among other things. And the reality we are dealing with is that, and it's true for the US, obviously, is that government budgets are shrinking. Decision makers are not paying much attention to these kind of problems that we are discussing here. When you talk about poverty here in this room, people are excited, but outside it's pretty lonely, etc., etc. So my question to the panel is, I have two questions. One is, how do we change the hearts and minds about all these issues that we've been discussing today, and we've been discussing for the last 40 years? That's question number one. And question number two is, one set of actors I haven't been hearing mentioned today is companies. Does the private sector have a role to play, and can we change that, basically, the kind of approach you are taking to those issues? Voilà, I'll stop there. Thank you.
So now our fast-thinking, fast-talking panel has exactly 45 seconds to answer those very rich questions. Take it away.
So, you have a few more minutes. You don't want to speak first? Y'all, 2 thumbs up.
If Bill says you have time, you have time.
To Bob, as you know, the survey of income and program participation has changed. So we can't make we can't do things in the exact same way. We are working on this. My colleague Luke Schaefer seems to think he should solve poverty in Detroit. So I'm getting him to attend to these issues. But from the SNAP administrative data, the answer looks like it's not as much as you would think. So yes, some responsiveness, but not very much. So stay tuned, and thank you for that. One thing on children, Stephanie DeLuca has followed children, both young children and adolescent children who moved as part of the Thompson Mobility Program in Baltimore. And her team has found that in terms of making connections, teenagers who move have a very hard time. They're really socially isolated in the new schools. Young children do very well, and she's followed those kids for many years now. And so this, echoes, I think, the MTO findings that it's really the younger kids who benefit.
It's actually part of the way Raj identifies causally the neighborhood thing. It turns out the age in which you move from neighborhood makes a huge difference. Two kids in the same family, young kid will do fine, older kid less. That really suggests it's neighborhood. Quickly, and then others will say, I think this question, I'm just going to focus briefly on this question of what do we do in terms of organizing unions and the like, certainly unbelievably important. The three of us were on a group called the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, and one of the people on that group was Ai-jen Po, who is the head of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And it's a remarkable group that focuses, not surprisingly, on domestic workers. But what it's not trying to do, you can't organize against all the families that don't have very much money. They can't pay you more. Partly it's just the structure of the market. And so what they instead are saying, how do we think about changing the way in which we reimburse and pay and so forth, things from home care workers to other sorts of things, put it in Medicaid. In fact, Larry and Ai-jen are working on a project like that. So I think the answer is some combination, but I do think it's more than, it's hard to call this just unions just have to get stronger in a world, particularly care workers to me is a great example, or it's very, very hard to imagine asking struggling families to pay more to other struggling families when it's too hard to make it. So I think that's critical. Second thing that came out of that work, which is relevant for this other thing, is we were asked to think about what would it take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty, this group was, and our first recommendation is we have to change the narrative. Mm-hmm. And I think we don't spend nearly enough time thinking about how we talk about it. I actually loved it earlier today when we talked about all the disadvantages white people have. I mean, imagine if that was the narrative. And I bet it's only in a small set of things. But another example of this is actually how we talk about struggling families. We talk about the poor. If there's ever othering language, it is the word the in front of it. If we talk about the whites or the blacks, or that's them. And yet, our story has to be one of belonging, and they're us. Those are us. Those are, we talked about in this group about how grandparents used to support paying, raising taxes to pay for better schools because it was their grandkids. It often wasn't literally their grandkids, but they were their kids. Now it's those kids. And I think how you do that, and that requires a lot more creativity than you can ever get from me. But I do think if we don't do that, we're dead. Because honestly, the narrative right now is terrible. And we need to do better.
Yes. So, no, I definitely agree with David about changing the narrative, and that's actually the othering phenomenon, and the work that Claudia Golden and I did in terms of support for schools and local policy in the first half of the 20th century. You found, as David noted, that where you had more elderly residents, you had greater support. You've seen a huge shift towards more elderly residents and lower support for schools locally, particularly when the racial and ethnic composition of the elderly looks different than the typical kid in the school system. So we have a huge problem in terms of the political economy there that we're going to need to address. In terms of the specific questions, I'll go quickly through, neighborhoods, kids, what we've seen in the data and the narrative is that, longer exposure to higher upward mobility, lower poverty areas has very beneficial effects. It builds these set of connections. It gives kids second chances that they wouldn't have otherwise. The mechanism doesn't seem to be traditional test scores. It seems to be more this, sense of set of connections and set of these broader life and social skills or whatever you call them that we're getting. Schools do matter, but it's not only the types of traditional things even in school. The parents don't seem the same sort of labor market outcomes, but as I noted, they are, in terms of parenting, they are often in what they perceive as safer and less stressed environments, and the improvements in mental health of the parents and in their physical health are probably contributory factors. So one shouldn't think this is something that's independent. And, the access to services there are important. So I think that, it is, both of them do matter. The final question, should you take STEM courses or take sociology? I don't know if I should be giving out career advice. In the data, STEM courses in the short run certainly lead to longer outcomes. It's a little overstated because people who do sort of sociology and other things end up having bigger trajectories overall. But the way I would think of it is you want to be someone who is sociology or humanity who also understands some STEM, and you can code even if that's not your thing. And we want engineers who also have read Bill Wilson and so is really the way you want to go.
Can I also add from Larry's work and many others, going to community colleges is a great idea as long as you go to the right community college and you find you use it to connect to something that really leads to a job. In some ways, that's much more important than sociology or science, whatever. Community colleges are some of the most extraordinary institutions in this country and some of the worst. It's hard to always know the difference, but they are the great hope and they are the great failure.
Yeah, well said.
All right. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Bill.
Oh, my goodness.